At night on the Sajó River in April of 1241, the men in the Hungarian camp try to sleep inside a ring of wagons while the dark presses close. Horse breath steaming, leather creaking, the low murmur of prayers and arguments that refuse to end. No one trusts the quiet. Somewhere beyond the river, something moves without torches. No songs, no challenge calls, only the feeling, hard to confess, harder to ignore, that the enemy is not merely waiting, it is measuring. By morning, the camp will learn what it means to be struck from more than one direction at once. Some will die with weapons in hand. Many will die unable to reach their weapons at all, trapped by their own defenses, blinded by smoke and confusion, shoved toward the river by men they cannot see clearly enough to hate. Those who survive will carry the same bewildering memory. This did not feel like a contest of bravery. It felt like a mechanism closing. Across Europe that spring, the fear spreads ahead of the riders. It moves faster than armies can assemble, faster than courts can agree on who leads, faster than priests can finish their sermons. Towns hear of burning villages and assume the danger is still distant, until the danger is at their gates. Messengers arrive hoarse with warnings, only to discover the warning is already obsolete. The enemy does not travel in a straight line. It appears, vanishes, and appears again, as if the map itself is lying. Europe is not weak, but it is arranged for another kind of war. Power is real and yet divided. Crowns rely on magnates, magnates defend privileges, bishops guard estates, towns defend charters. Armies can be raised, but they rise on obligations measured in days and seasons, and they move at the speed of negotiation. When danger arrives, it does not meet a single wall. It meets a patchwork, each piece proud in isolation, each uncertain about the piece beside it. Hungary sits at the hinge of this world, and by 1241 the hinge is already strained. The lands east of it, the old buffer of shifting peoples and uneasy bargains, have collapsed under earlier blows. The Rus's principalities are battered. Refugees and rumors spill west. The Cumans, steppe riders driven from their own catastrophe, press into Hungary seeking protection, and their arrival turns every political quarrel into a question of betrayal. King Bela IV tries to strengthen royal authority against nobles who resent him for it, and now he must persuade those same nobles to unite for a threat that feels unbelievable until it is unavoidable. Far to the east, the force coming toward them does not depend on anyone's belief. The Mongol Empire has learned to make distance behave. It treats scouting as an opening act of conquest. Roads, rivers, forage, the timing of musters, the psychology of rulers. It moves through relays of messengers that make information travel as fast as decisions. It can split into separate columns without dissolving into chaos, and it can converge again on schedule. To people facing it for the first time, it seems less like an army and more like a system that has rehearsed their responses. Inside that system is an older commander whose name matters because of what happens, not because of how he looks in a chronicle, Subutai. Others carry royal blood and claim precedence, but Subutai builds campaigns the way a craftsman builds a trap, quietly, patiently, with attention to roots, timings, and human reflexes. He understands something his enemies do not want to accept. If you can create more than one emergency at once, you do not need to fight the whole of a kingdom. The kingdom will fracture itself trying to decide where to stand. The shock of 1241 is not only that Europe can lose battles, it is that Europe can be forced to fight on a timetable it does not control, pulled toward the wrong fires, arriving late to the right ones, and discovering that the great rivers and mountains it trusts are only obstacles for the side that hesitates. In 1235, at the Mongol court in the distant heartlands of the empire, the decision to strike west did not sound like a plan to terrify Europe. It sounded like administration by other means. Conquest had created obligations. Princes needed campaigns that rewarded them and kept them occupied. Revenues and tribute had to be expanded. The empire's internal balance, the rivalry of lineages, the prestige of the ruling house, the legitimacy of succession, required motion. A world-spanning polity that had grown through war could not simply stop and expect itself to remain intact. The authorization for a Western expedition came through the empire's political rituals, councils, assemblies, the gathering of the elite. The words preserved later are filtered through memory and propaganda, but the direction is clear. The West meant the steppe beyond the Volga, the forests and river towns of the Rus, and then the rich plains and kingdoms beyond, regions described by merchants and interpreters as much as by maps. For the Mongols, vague geography was not an obstacle. It was an invitation to reconnaissance. Batu, grandson of Chinggis Khan, was appointed as leading prince of the expedition. He carried lineage and the right to command other princes who would never forget their own claims. Around him rode men of royal blood, young enough to hunger for glory and old enough to resent being ordered. In such a company, an older commander who belonged to no royal faction could become indispensable. Subutai's authority was not inherited, it was accumulated. He had served in the great conquests of Chinggis Khan and had learned to turn speed into a form of certainty. He had seen empires collapse not only from defeat in battle, but from failure in coordination. And he had practiced the kind of war that does not seek a single decisive clash unless it is already engineered to be decisive. Years earlier, Subutai had already ridden far toward the lands that would later be called Europe. In 1223, he and other commanders had fought at the Kalka River against a coalition of Rus's princes and steppe allies. That earlier expedition was not an attempt to conquer and hold. It was an education, a test of distances, supplies, and how Western armies assembled, how long it took them to gather, how quickly they panicked, how readily they could be induced to chase. When the Mongols withdrew after Kalka, they did not retreat empty-handed. They carried home an impression of an enemy world that was brave, proud, and slow to act as one. The expedition that began in the late 1230s was therefore not improvised. It was built on accumulation. Conquered cities providing engineers and supplies, captured officials providing administrative knowledge, steppe auxiliaries providing local intelligence, and a chain of messengers and scouts that could turn rumor into actionable fact. Where Europe relied on councils and letters sealed with wax, the Mongols relied on riders and reports delivered in hours, not weeks. Their advantage was not a mysterious Asian genius. It was an institutional habit to treat information as a weapon and coordination as the foundation of violence. The first blows fell on the Volga-Bulgar lands and then into the Rus. These were not empty spaces. They were zones of trade, fortified towns, shifting principalities, and bitter rivalries. The Mongols approached them with a method already refined: divide targets, exploit political fractures, punish refusal, reward submission with incorporation. Cities that surrendered could sometimes be spared immediate destruction and used as bases. Cities that resisted could be destroyed with a brutality designed to shorten the next siege by making examples. For outsiders, the Mongols were often imagined as purely cavalry, an endless swarm of horsemen. In practice, the empire moved as a composite machine. Steppe cavalry provided mobility and tactical flexibility, but the empire also carried siege expertise, much of it drawn from China and the Islamic world, compelled by conquest and kept in motion by necessity. Engineers, forced laborers, and specialists traveled with the armies. Techniques were borrowed and improved. Even a field battle could be shaped by devices more associated with sieges, and towns that counted on their walls sometimes discovered that the walls were only the beginning of a contest. The Rus's campaign was not a single event, but a grinding sequence. Town after town fell. Refugees fled west. News traveled with them, growing more apocalyptic with each retelling, because the destruction was real and the reasons for it were hard to grasp. A prince who had never seen Mongol tactics could not easily believe reports that an army could move so far so fast and still fight effectively. Yet the proof kept arriving as smoke and emptiness. In December 1240, Kiev fell. Its destruction carried symbolic weight far beyond its walls, but it also served the conquerors in practical ways. It clarified the map. It opened routes. It produced captives who could translate, guide, and build. And it pushed the frontier of fear toward the Carpathians and the Hungarian plain. Hungary watched the east with a mixture of disbelief and dread. The kingdom's internal politics were already tense. Bela IV had inherited a realm where magnates guarded privileges and lands that earlier kings had ceded. His attempts to restore royal authority were seen by some nobles as a threat to their hereditary rights. In such an atmosphere, unity required more than a proclamation. It required trust, and trust was scarce. Then came the Cumans. Driven by Mongol pressure and steppe rivalries, they sought refuge in Hungary under their leader, known in Latin sources as Curtin. Bela saw opportunity. Steppe cavalry, who understood steppe war, a group dependent on royal protection, a potential counterweight to rebellious magnates. Many Hungarian nobles saw something else: outsiders with unfamiliar customs, herds that damaged fields, feuds that spilled into local disputes, and the suspicion, never far from the surface, that the Cumans were either Mongol agents or the cause of Mongol pursuit. Warnings arrived from the east, stories of cities leveled, armies broken, princes killed or forced to submit. Bela sent envoys and letters westward, appealing to other rulers and to the papacy. He also began preparations, calling the host, organizing defenses, attempting to secure border passes. But medieval preparation had built-in delays. Feudal levies took time to gather. Supplies took time to arrange. Cooperation required bargaining. And the calendar mattered. Men owed service for set periods. They thought about planting and harvest even when the horizon was burning. Mongol envoys delivered demands that were blunt even by the standards of conquest. The message varied in wording, but not in spirit. Submit, deliver fugitives, accept Mongol authority, and avoid destruction. European chroniclers often rendered these demands as monstrous arrogance, and in a sense they were. Yet they were also routine for the Mongols, a standardized opening move meant to incorporate new territories without wasting effort on every stronghold. Bela refused. Refusal was almost inevitable. A king could not surrender sovereignty without dissolving his own legitimacy. But refusal carried a consequence that was new in its scale. For the Mongols, refusal was not a negotiating position. It was a classification. The kingdom had chosen the path that invited punishment. The invasion that followed was built to overwhelm not only armies, but the ability of societies to respond coherently. The Mongols moved as winter loosened into spring, when frozen rivers could still function as roads, and the ground could bear weight without turning into mud. Their forces were divided into columns. This was not dispersion by accident, it was dispersion by design. Smaller units could forage without exhausting a single area. Multiple columns could threaten multiple regions. And when the moment came, those columns could converge with a timing that made the enemy feel surrounded by fate rather than by men. The plan aimed to keep Hungary isolated. A northern wing would strike into Poland and Silesia, ensuring that the princes and knights of those regions were too busy defending their own towns to ride south to help Hungary. Meanwhile, the main pressure would fall on Hungary itself through the Carpathian routes and the northeastern approaches, with additional columns probing Transylvania and the southern corridors. The result would not be one war, but several overlapping emergencies, each one convincing local leaders that the catastrophe was centered on them. In the north, the first signs were smoke and flight. Krakow was attacked and burned, villages emptied, roads filled with refugees carrying fragments of the same story, riders in the distance, the sudden collapse of any defense too small to hold, the eerie way the enemy did not linger, but kept moving. In such a landscape, panic became an intelligence system of its own. Rumors ran ahead of reality, and then, with cruel efficiency, reality caught up. Henry II, Duke of Silesia, later remembered as Henry the Pious, faced a problem that was familiar to medieval rulers and yet newly urgent. To raise an army was to summon nobles with their contingents, to negotiate with allies, to gather men who owed service for limited periods and who came with their own interests. Meanwhile, the invader did not behave like a conventional army. It did not sit down before a city and wait. It harassed, withdrew, reappeared, and shifted direction in ways that made every defensive decision feel late. Henry assembled what he could: knights, infantry from towns, contingents from nearby regions, and whatever allied support might arrive in time. He did not lack courage, and his forces did not lack skill, but they were assembling under a cloud of uncertainty. Where was the main Mongol force? Were these raids a prelude to a siege, or a diversion, or the whole invasion? Every hour spent answering the wrong question reduced the value of the right answer. The battle that came near Legnica on April 9, 1241, has been remembered with a mixture of reverence and horror. European chroniclers later emphasized the heroism of Christian knights and the cruelty of an alien enemy, and in doing so, they captured something real: the shock of discovering that armored cavalry could be neutralized by tactics that refused the chivalric script. The Mongols harassed with arrows, withdrew, and drew units out of formation, feigned flight, a tactic known in earlier steppe wars but rarely encountered at this scale in Central Europe, tempted knights to pursue beyond support. Some accounts describe smoke used to blur vision and break cohesion. The exact details are filtered through fear and memory, but the effect is unmistakable. The battle did not unfold as a single clear clash. It fractured. And once it fractured, the Mongols exploited the fractures with speed. Henry was killed. His army broke. The field was not merely lost, it was emptied, leaving Silesia exposed and its defenses disorganized. Yet the Mongols did not settle down to govern Poland. They had not come north to build a new administration. They had come to keep Poland and its neighbors occupied, anxious, and unable to send meaningful help south. The psychological blow traveled further than the army itself. News of Legnica moved westward like a bruise spreading under the skin. In cities that had never seen a Mongol rider, the story arrived in familiar medieval forms: sermons, letters, rumors carried by merchants. But the content was unfamiliar. It suggested that Europe's best fighters could be beaten not by greater courage, but by greater control of the battlefield's rhythm. It suggested that a war could be won by breaking coordination, not by meeting strength with strength. While Europe's north was reeling, Hungary was already entering its own catastrophe, and the timing mattered. The northern campaign ensured that the resources and attention of neighboring regions were fixed on their own survival. Messages that might have coordinated a broader response arrived too late or were distrusted. Rulers who might have helped hesitated, uncertain whether moving troops would leave their own lands exposed. The Mongol design did not require that every leader be cowardly. It only required that every leader be responsible for a piece of the patchwork, and that responsibility would do the rest. Inside Hungary, the Cumans became the spark that fear was waiting for. As Mongol pressure grew, suspicion turned into violence. In March 1241, in Pest, Curtin was murdered by Hungarians. The act was both a political eruption and a strategic disaster. It did not remove an internal threat. It created one. The Cumans, now convinced that the kingdom had betrayed them, fled Hungary, and as they fled they looted and burned in anger and survival. The countryside suffered. The king lost the steppe allies he had hoped would help him counter steppe methods, and the kingdom's unity, already fragile, cracked further under the weight of blame. Bela still had to fight. A medieval king who abandoned the field could lose more than territory. He could lose legitimacy. He gathered what forces he could: magnate contingents, royal troops, church levies, men from towns, and moved eastward, seeking to meet the invaders before they dissolved the kingdom's remaining coherence. He chose the Sajó River region because rivers were natural barriers, and because European warfare had long treated bridges and crossings as choke points. If the crossing could be held, perhaps a battle could be forced on favorable terms. The Hungarians had reason to hope. They were not facing a handful of raiders. They were facing a major Mongol force, and major forces could be compelled into major battles. If Hungary could concentrate enough cavalry and infantry at the right point, perhaps it could blunt the invasion and restore confidence long enough for reinforcements to gather. But the Mongol method treated the river not as a wall, but as a line to be crossed by choice. Fixation on a single bridge could be turned into a weapon against the fixer. Subutai understood that if the enemy believed the bridge was the decisive point, then the decisive point could be made elsewhere. On April 10th, Hungarian forces skirmished near the bridge. They fought well enough to push Mongol elements back, and in the rhythm of medieval war, where holding a crossing often meant holding the day, this felt like a sign. Morale rose. The camp settled into the assumption that the enemy would attack the bridge again, and that the bridge would decide the outcome. In the night, the nature of the danger changed without announcing itself. Mongol forces worked to create additional crossings. Accounts differ on the exact engineering: temporary bridges, forced fords, improvised structures built by specialists and laborers. But the pattern is consistent. The Hungarians were pressured to watch one point while other points were prepared. In the darkness, the river's quiet became a cover. The camp's confidence became a curtain. Then dawn came, and with it the closing of the mechanism. The Hungarian camp was arranged with wagons drawn into a defensive enclosure, a common practice meant to create a fortified position. Such an enclosure could protect against raids and provide an anchor for troops. But it also created confinement. It gathered men, horses, and supplies into a crowded space where panic could spread quickly and where movement could become collision. The Mongol assault did not arrive as a single noble charge. It arrived as coordination, pressure at the bridge renewed, missile fire intensified. The Hungarians were forced to commit attention and troops to the crossing they expected. Then the other pressure arrived, from the flank, from the rear, from the angles that the bridge-centric defense had not been built to absorb. The camp was struck by projectiles that many soldiers would have associated with sieges rather than field battles. Whether stone throwers or other engines, the effect mattered more than the exact device. It signaled that nowhere inside the camp was safe, and it made the enclosure feel less like protection and more like a pen. Smoke, whether from fires set deliberately or from the chaos of burning material, further damaged visibility. Commands became harder to hear. Units could not easily see one another, and when men cannot see their own line, they begin to imagine that it has already collapsed. Hungarian knights charged where they could. Infantry held ground where they were able, but courage could not compensate for a structure of battle that denied clarity. When pressure comes from more than one direction, a medieval host held together by personal loyalties and localized command struggles to pivot as a single body. It becomes a collection of brave fragments, and fragments can be destroyed in sequence. As the enclosure became crowded with wounded and with men trying to reposition, the wagons that were meant to protect became obstacles to retreat. Horses panicked, men shoved. The river, which had been chosen as a barrier, became the destination of flight. Many died, not in heroic combat, but in the desperate physics of escape, trampled, drowned, cut down in pursuit. King Bela escaped with a small entourage. His flight was not simply personal survival, it was the sign that the kingdom's central defense had failed. The battle at the Sajó, often called Mohi, did not merely defeat an army. It removed the instrument by which medieval Hungary organized resistance. Without the host, defense became local, improvised, and uneven, and that was precisely the condition the Mongols exploited best. After Mohi, Hungary became a landscape of moving fear. Mongol detachments spread across the plains, raiding, hunting down survivors, capturing towns, seizing supplies, and preventing regrouping. The speed of their operations, made possible by multiple remounts and disciplined division of forces, meant that any attempt to gather a new army could be preempted. A noble might rally men in one county only to learn that another region was burning and that routes between them were already threatened. The Mongols did not apply destruction as a simple impulse. It functioned as coercion and logistics. Towns that surrendered quickly could sometimes be used, at least temporarily, as supply points. Resistance could be punished in ways designed to shorten the next resistance. The pattern was not random cruelty, it was control through demonstration. Here, fortifications mattered. Hungary, at this time, had fewer stone castles than it would later build, and many settlements relied on earthworks and wooden defenses that could not withstand sustained pressure. Where stone walls existed, they sometimes held. Strongholds could slow the invader, force detours, and deny easy extraction. In places like Esztergom, resistance was real and costly. The Mongols could take towns, but they could not afford to spend a season stuck before every wall. Their advantage depended on staying mobile, and mobility imposed its own limits. Bela fled westward and then south, seeking refuge behind stronger walls and more difficult geography. His flight became a journey through his own kingdom's unraveling, and the symbolism was corrosive. A medieval state could endure many defeats. It struggled to endure the image of its king as a fugitive chased by steppe riders across his own land. Beyond Hungary, Europe reacted in slow waves. Rulers received letters and fragments of reports. Some believed the danger exaggerated, some understood too late. The Holy Roman Emperor and the papacy issued appeals, instructions, and warnings, but neither could conjure a unified army quickly enough to meet an enemy already deep within Hungary. Europe did not lack manpower. It lacked a mechanism to concentrate it on demand, and the Mongol campaign exploited that absence with cold precision. By late summer and autumn of 1241, Mongol forces reached the Danube basin. The Danube was more than a river. It was an organizing line in Europe's imagination, a boundary between regions, a corridor of trade, a marker of what seemed like the continent's inner space. To hear that the Mongols had reached it was to feel that the world's edge had moved. Towns along the river prepared as they could, reinforcing gates, gathering supplies, moving families, arranging watches. But preparation under uncertainty produces superstition as easily as strategy. Was the Danube a wall or merely a pause? Were these raids or the beginning of a longer occupation? The Mongols did not help with clarity. They probed, threatened, punished, and moved on. They behaved like an imperial instrument completing a task, eliminating organized resistance, extracting resources, and testing the terrain for what might follow. Winter returned, and with it another demonstration of how the campaign had been tuned to conditions that Europeans often treated as fixed. Rivers froze, marshes hardened, routes that were impassable in mud became passable in ice. The Danube itself, in places, could become a road. Regions that had hoped water would protect them felt renewed pressure as Mongol detachments crossed into areas that had believed themselves shielded by geography. Winter also altered the invaders' constraints. Grazing was harder. Supplies were finite. The Mongols compensated by splitting into smaller groups, spreading across countryside, extracting what they could, and maintaining communication through riders. This made them harder to fight. A large European force could not be everywhere at once. Concentrate in one place, and the enemy could disperse. Disperse to chase every detachment, and the enemy could concentrate for a sudden strike. Bela was pushed toward the Adriatic coast, toward places where stone walls and maritime connections offered a different kind of security. In Dalmatia, coastal towns such as Trogir and Split had fortifications and access to sea routes that steppe warfare could not easily negate. Mongol forces pursued into this region, raiding the countryside and probing defenses, but here the terrain began to steal some of their advantage. Steeper ground, narrower routes, and fortified coastal nodes complicated the kind of rapid envelopments that had worked on the plains. The campaign did not end because the Mongols suddenly became merciful, or because Europe found a hidden reserve of unity. It ended because the Mongol Empire itself was shifting beneath the expedition. In December 1241, far away in Mongolia, Ögedei, the great Khan, died. In a polity where legitimacy and authority rested on a ruling house and a system of election among elites, such a death could not be treated as distant news. Succession brought rivalries into the open. Princes who remained too long on the periphery risked losing their position at the center. The withdrawal that followed was therefore both political and practical. The Western campaign had achieved stunning results. Major armies shattered, a kingdom devastated, a continent shaken. But turning Central Europe into a stable, taxable province would have required time, occupation forces, administrative integration, and the reduction of fortified nodes, an effort far beyond a fast-moving punitive expedition. Meanwhile, the devastation inflicted on the countryside made sustained extraction harder. Winter and thaw created logistical challenges, and the empire demanded the presence of its princes for the struggle over succession. Subutai's hand can be sensed even here in the manner of departure. Withdrawal was not a panicked retreat. It was disciplined movement under constraints, carrying spoils and captives, avoiding encirclement, choosing routes that balanced speed with security. Scouts rode ahead. Flanks were guarded. Units dispersed for forage and reconsolidated when needed. Rivers crossed back toward the east as thaw threatened to turn roads into mud. The empire's method did not vanish with the decision to leave. It was the reason leaving could be done without collapse. In the spring of 1242, the Mongols departed Hungary. For Europeans, the departure was almost as unsettling as the arrival. Armies that had seemed unstoppable simply vanished back into the east. No Christian coalition marched them out. No great victory forced their hand. They had come, shattered, and gone, leaving behind a question that would linger for generations. Had Europe escaped because it was strong, or because the empire that struck it had reasons of its own to pause? Hungary's immediate aftermath was measured in absence. Villages stood empty. Fields went unplanted. Trade routes fell silent. Labor disappeared into death, captivity, and flight. Bela returned to a kingdom that had nearly stopped functioning, and the lessons he drew were not abstract. A realm built on feudal levies and scattered wooden fortifications had been exposed. If Hungary were to endure another such invasion, it needed hard points that could hold even when the field army failed. Bela encouraged the building of stone castles and fortified towns, reorganized settlement patterns, and strengthened urban defenses. Over time, he would be remembered as a second founder of the kingdom, not because he created Hungary, but because he rebuilt it under the memory of catastrophe. The landscape itself changed in response to 1241, as stone replaced timber and fortifications became less a symbol of status and more a matter of survival. Across Europe, the invasion left scars that were not only physical. It challenged assumptions about military superiority and about the safety provided by distance. It revealed how much depended on coordination, how vulnerable a patchwork of jurisdictions could be to an enemy that treated speed and intelligence as primary weapons. It also produced distortions. Some interpreted the withdrawal as divine mercy. Some blamed internal enemies. Some reached for apocalyptic explanations because it was easier than accepting that a human empire had mastered a method Europe did not yet possess. Subutai returned east into a Mongol world, entering a tense political phase. His reputation remained strong within the empire, where commanders were judged by outcomes more than by lineage. He had helped design an operation that reached the Danube, destroyed major armies in quick succession, and exposed the weaknesses of a political order built for slower wars. He did not need to conquer all of Europe to prove the point. The campaign of 1241 had already done what it was built to do. It had broken the ability of kingdoms to respond as kingdoms, forcing them to react as frightened regions, each defending itself while the larger structure of resistance dissolved. The memory that remained in Europe was not only of burning towns or lost battles, it was the sensation of being outpaced, of realizing that decision itself could be made into a weapon. In 1241, Central Europe lived briefly inside someone else's timetable. When the riders turned back toward the east, the timetable ended. The knowledge did not. It endured in new walls of stone, in altered policies, in sermons and chronicles that tried to give the disaster a shape, and in a quiet, persistent awareness that the distance between rumor and ruin could be measured not in months, but in days.